China's big annual political meetings in Beijing. What are some of the headlines at this year's two sessions? Hi everyone, I'm Sean Calebs and filling in for Anand Naidu, and you're watching The Heat. It's political season in Beijing as China's National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference gather for what's called two sessions. Thousands of delegates are attending from all across China as major economic policies and goals are presented. The meetings give important insight into China's domestic and foreign policy. There's an awful lot to discuss, and we're going to get right to our panel. Joining us from Beijing, Victor Gao. He is a Chinese international relations expert. Right here in Washington, D.C., Cheng Li. He is director and senior fellow at the John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution. Also with us in the studio, our good friend Saruhan Hatipoglu. He is the CEO of Business Environment Risk Intelligence and also a global economic analyst for CGTN. And in Beijing, we're also joined by our friend, CGTN correspondent Nathan King. Welcome to the show, everyone. Glad to have you here. Nathan, I want to start with you. Two sessions, we see the focus turn to China's foreign policy, talking about economics, talking about the way it's working with the rest of the world. Very important speech on Friday there. Bring us up to date on what's been going on.
Yeah, absolutely. A 2-hour press conference from Wang Yi, the foreign minister here. It was standing room only. Really, you know, the focus on US-China relations right now, as well as all the other global hotspots, really interesting. I think what stood out to me was that full-throated defense of Huawei, a national champion, as you know, here in the US, not to be go to a lamb to the slaughter. Very pointed comments. Also a robust defense of the Belt and Road Initiative, especially when it comes to allegations from Western countries about basically a debt trap, really sort of spelling out how actually a lot of debt in countries where the Belt and Road is going is historic, it's already there, and that China's adds to debt to around 10% of these countries. So I thought it was a very confident and full-throated defense of Chinese foreign policy.
And Victor, if I can pick up with you, we've heard obviously the discussion about Huawei, no huge shock there, and also about the debt trap in African nations. But a lot of attention is also focused on the U.S.-China relationship. I want to play you just a clip of what Wang Yi had to say.
Cooperation benefits both sides. Confrontation will hurt us both. While cooperating, we will have some competition. That's normal for international relations. The key is how we handle it. If we emphasize competition, it will compromise cooperation.
Talking about the cooperation aspect of all this, Victor, and it's not just the U.S. and China who have so much at stake in this. Really, the whole global economy could hinge on this to a huge degree. What's your take on what the foreign minister had to say?
I think Foreign Minister Wang Yi made very important points yesterday, including on the nature of China-U.S. relations. Indeed, China-U.S. relations right now is at a crossroads, and the core reason for the deterioration of the relations between the two countries comes mainly from the United States. Purely from the Chinese perspective, we do not want to be confrontational with the United States. China wants to be a friend with the United States and want to be a partner with the United States. Therefore, I think Foreign Minister Wang Yi, together with President Xi Jinping and all the other Chinese leaders, and I think all the Chinese people, we want to have friendship and peace and partnership with the United States. And the last and the least thing we have in mind is to be confrontational with the United States. And I hope the American government and the American people can really understand the true nature of the good intention and the action here in China towards the American government and the American people.
Cheng Li, so much really hinges on the U.S.-China relationship moving forward. And to take a page out of Barack Obama's book, if you will, there's nothing wrong with being competitive, but you don't have to be at each other's throats, for lack of a better word, especially from an economic standpoint. I want to play you a bit more about what Wang Yi said, because we can talk about this a lot, but it's very important what the foreign minister had to say.
如果一味放大竞争，就会挤压合作的空间。
Exaggerating our competition out of all proportion would squeeze our space of cooperation. The right attitude is to focus on expanding our cooperation. This is both in our mutual interest and what we owe to the world.
Cheng Li, I want to get you to weigh in on this, but also pick up on what Victor said, saying China doesn't want this approach, the way the whole trade dispute is playing out. But in any way, do you think the Trump administration has any reason to move forward the way it has, looking at the trade disparity and looking at what Trump says has been a one-sided deal for a long time? Or is that just, for lack of a better term, hyperbole?
Well, I think that we should avoid this kind of difference and point finger to each other. Of course, in Washington, D.C., the atmosphere at the moment is very critical of China. Now, that in a way differ from Obama administration. I remember that both President Obama and Hillary Clinton talk about that we should benefit from each other's success economically and in other domains. But now it sounds like we overemphasize competition, and sometimes some people even talk about zero-sum game, and this is certainly dangerous. But when you look at beyond Washington, the Beltway, I think Americans' attitude towards China largely remain the same. We still have a profound respect for China and also impressed by China's achievement, including poverty reduction over the past 4 decades. And some people think that we probably should also look at ourselves. Now, the real issue is the previous policy about engagement now under review. I think there's a good reason for the United States to rethink about that strategy, but it's not over yet. I don't think most people want to contain China or strategic thinkers. But in fundamental way, I agree with Minister Wang Yi. We should also look at the big picture. The big picture is still we need a cooperation in at least 2 most important areas. One is both sides do not want to go to war. We want to prevent war. That is nothing is more important.
Even a trade war.
Absolutely. Yeah. Secondly, there's also the maintained the global economic stability with the financial stability, economic stability. This is the 2 largest economy in the world, and we can only benefit through the stability rather than the collapse of the economic system.
Saruhan, the 2 largest economies on Earth. We've heard so much give and take, and to use the words, there shouldn't be a we and they, but how closely do you think the United States is watching what's going on, especially earlier this week when Li Keqiang spelled out the business plan moving forward, and now, of course, the 2-hour news conference today where Wang Yi talked about the hopes and what they want to do moving forward.
They're watching it very closely, and they're listening what the outcome from this meeting is going to be. Look, there's a lot of things on the table right now. And what I heard today, I don't know what the panel thinks, but what I heard today from the foreign minister was a defiant tone. This was not a tone to sit down and resolve differences. China is upset. Chinese government is being pressured within itself, by the way. There are different schools of thought here that the U.S. is pushing us too much. So all the eyes are here. As far as the U.S. is concerned, they're looking at the foreign investment law. What is that going to be? Because even though I personally think at the end of the day, this trade agreement is going to focus on numbers, cutting down the trade deficit, the steps being taken in China right now are focusing on intellectual property issues. It is focusing on forced technology issues. This foreign investment law is very important. And I think it is going to pass in March. And if it does, that might herald some kind of a warming of relations between the 2 countries.
Nathan, I see you shaking your head in the background. I also want to talk to you about something you discussed at the top of the show, and that is the Belt and Road Initiative and China and its relationship with Russia. I want to play you a bit again about what Wang Yi said about China and Russia.
When China and Russia stand together, the world will be a safer and a more peaceful and stable place.
And Nathan, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Wang Yi said that Vladimir Putin's going to be at the next Belt and Road meeting in Beijing coming up?
Yeah, in fact, he will be. Yeah, he'll be one of the heads of state coming to the Belt and Road, Second Belt and Road Forum for heads of state in April. That's going to be the biggest sort of diplomatic event going on here in Beijing. And, you know, for me, that was this talk of sort of Moscow-Beijing axis was very, very important. But the Belt and Road is also hugely important. I'm sure everyone saw the headlines this week that Italy is considering signing on to the Belt and Road Initiative, the first G7 member to do so. And that could happen when Xi Jinping visits Italy later on this month. Now, this is hugely important. It's the first G7 big member of the European Union, and also given the historic sort of Silk Road ties that we've seen, if any student of history remembers, between Italy, city-states, and the Silk Road with Imperial China, this is really quite an incredible turnaround. It's creating a lot of headlines here and a lot of pushback immediately from the United States. So that will be a victory, and also I think a sort of vindication of the strategy, because a lot of pressure has been put on Beijing about and questions about the transparency of Belt and Road initiatives, about debt, as we said, infrastructure development. If Italy, which let's face it is one of the biggest trading nations in the world, signs onto it, it's a real sign that the sort of pushback against the BRI from Western nations is really not working.
Nathan, I want to follow up real quickly. I have a bit of jealousy on my part. You've had a front row seat to all of that this week. Tell me about some of the diplomatic leaders, the business leaders from other nations who have been there, and how much attention do you think it is getting in Beijing from other countries like Italy?
Yeah, I think this is a really excellent point. You know, for a lot of people in the West, perhaps the two sessions is a little far away. There's other things going on. But I can tell you, for diplomats based here, is the #1 ticket in town. You know, on the day of the work report from Li Keqiang, at the opening of the MPC, I actually was outside the Great Hall of the People and talked to diplomat after diplomat after diplomat about what they were looking for in the two sessions, whether they be from Africa, Latin America, Europe, Eurasia, and the Americas as well. And it is quite amazing how many countries really go through this whole work report, what's being said here, in terms of their own national interests. I spoke to a lot of countries in West Africa who are very, very impressed by the poverty alleviation methods, for example. Okay, one size doesn't fit all, but they feel that they can learn from a lot of that in different ways to do that. I spoke to the ambassador from Brazil, who was very, very interested in, of course, the foreign investment law. They've done extremely well because of the fallout of the US-China trade tensions with soybeans, but they want to cement relationships going forward. So it is really seen as one of the global events, if you like, on the diplomatic calendar here, because you know it's not often you get a chance to see this many Chinese leaders in one place, not just at the national level, but also at the regional level. And as you know, places like Sichuan have populations and economies that rival the size of major countries.
Yeah, indeed. Victor, let's talk about the fact that China has been such a spark to the global economic engine for such a long time. And as we mentioned, Li Keqiang spelling out what he hopes China is going to do moving forward, economic growth at somewhere between 6.5%. What about 11 million new urban jobs is promised? How important is that going to be to the whole 2020, lift the nation out of poverty? And are you concerned that there has been discussion from all over the world that China's economy is slowing down, that the brakes are being tapped more significantly now than in the past?
Yes, indeed, the Chinese economy in terms of the GDP growth rate, for example, is slowing down. However, this needs to be looked at more objectively. Why? Mainly because the base of the Chinese economy has expanded so much that even though we had a slower growth rate of 6.5% last year, the actual addition to the Chinese economy last year was a very, very large number. And further, I would say, the 6.5% GDP growth for 2018 was much faster, much better than all the developed countries' GDP growth in any particular country. So I think we really need to look at this very objectively. The Chinese economy is already the largest economy if we use the purchasing power parity, and the second largest economy if we use the official exchange rate. and it's still growing at such a rapid pace. Now, further, I would say, whatever that's happening at the two sessions, or the Lianghui as we call it here in China, not only is so important for China, but truly it has global implications, because whatever the Chinese people and the Chinese government do really reaches all corners of the world.
Cheng Li, let's talk a bit more about the work report and moving forward, China's goals. We know that there's this very ambitious goal to lift the entire nation out of poverty by 2020. Sure. The fact that they have been able to lift hundreds of millions out over the past 40 years, simply amazing. What about social services, healthcare, items such as that moving forward? And what will be the challenge to reach those autonomous regions and the really impoverished regions over the next 2 years?
Well, Xi Jinping has made a promise that by 2020, China will completely eliminate absolute poverty. And the definition is it's about $2 per day, based on World Bank. Mm-hmm. Now, Bill Gates just made a remark a few weeks ago. He said that China lifted out of 800 million people out of poverty over the past 4 decades. 800 million is 10 times of Germany's population. And so that tells you that how remarkable it was. And but the last group is certainly most difficult, but exactly. The Chinese government made a commitment. I think there's tremendous room to for China to achieve that, partly because this NPC meeting really emphasized reduce tax and also reduce all the kind of burdens and provide the loans for small and the medium-sized private companies. Mm-hmm. That certainly will help China's economic dynamics. There's another important plan, which is actually not on the news. It's the what happened in Guangdong, the Bay Area, mm-hmm. Gigantic project, as Victor Gao just mentioned, that Guangdong currently just one province is ranked 15 in terms of GDP in the world, equal to Mexico. But it's not only just Guangdong Bay Area, but Shanghai, Jiangsu, and Zhejiang, and Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei, and also Chongqing and Sichuan. These all become dynamic engines. Mm-hmm. So China can maintain certain degree of that development. Will also not only reduce poverty population, but also enlarge the middle class. So I think in that regard, I'm actually quite optimistic.
It's very interesting moving forward. And we also heard the Foreign Minister, Saruhan, talk about the two words multilateralism and globalization. I want to play you just a bit about what Wang Yi had to say about that and get your reaction.
China hopes to have more dialogue with Europe to properly handle and manage the situation. In a world full of uncertainties, China and Europe are both for multilateralism and against unilateralism and protectionism.
Yeah, it's a big world, it's a complex world, and all these relationships, the interworking. We've talked about the U.S. and Russia, their relationships with China, but the EU, very important.
Very important, and the two sides are taking very concrete steps. I want to build on Nathan's point about Italy. This is really big news. It is probably a symbolic move, but it also shows us the divisions within European Union as to how to deal with China. There's a lot of crackdown right now for foreign investment coming from China into the EU. What Italy is saying is, look, I'm going to make my own decisions because I need this investment. Our region is slowing down, and I'm going to sign this memorandum of understanding. This is an absolutely big move. Going back to what needs to be done, all the multilateralism and everything, mm-hmm. I want to say that, also building on Victor's point, I'll disagree with him a little bit on that. China still needs to grow at a certain level.
Absolutely.
We will take a 4% growth in this country for 2 years any day. China cannot handle that because China has to absorb, and China is moving from a fixed investment-based economy to a services-based economy. These things take a lot of capital. So the measures that the Chinese government is taking, the tax cuts, providing some incentives to companies, private companies especially, are steps in the right direction. But at the same time, they have to be multilateral, they have to be global in mind, and they have been, and they're going to push that.
Cheng Li, I want to ask you a bit about that, because last year during two sessions we heard President Xi say about the hundreds of thousands of Chinese students who were studying everywhere in France, the United States, wherever. He wants those students to get the best education possible, then bring that knowledge back to China. Firstly, how important is that? And secondly, just another story out today that it's going to be more and more difficult for the best and brightest Chinese students to come to the U.S. What does that do to this whole dynamic?
Well, it's a very good question. That training China's future generation was the greatest hope for the United States, but now become the worst fear. It sounds like these people will return to China, will undermine American technology competitiveness. This is certainly the wrong idea. I mean, Americans' value is because of openness, transparency, and also America is a country of immigrants. But this is all against American value, the current move. And so there's a lot of criticism in the United States about this kind of immigration policy, this kind of, someone said, the new McCarthyism against the foreigners. I also noticed the chancellor of Berkeley made a statement. The recent months, the discrimination against Chinese descent or Chinese scholars from China, and along with some people from the Middle East, really remind her the dark age of California's history, with the 1940s, with the Exclusion Act, etc. So I think that's a really wake-up call. Again, this will only undermine American interests, but also the educational exchange is the best bridge for contributing mutual understanding and peace. Mm-hmm. If we do not believe that, what do we believe? We're just isolated and so again, I think, of course, I do believe that the American people and most of our American policymakers will find that this will not be the direction we should go. Even President Donald Trump said we will continue with education exchange with China. And so I hope that is the direction that the United States will move to. Otherwise, we'll only hurt American interests. And so this is the things that really happened quite dramatic over a year.
Nathan, let's talk a bit about that, how China wants to move forward, going from just made in China to created in China, and really wants to step up and virtually high-tech, AI, virtually everything. And what kind of attention is that getting right now, and how is that playing into this whole dynamic about the whole trade dispute with the U.S.?
I think this is an absolutely excellent question, Sean. I haven't been to China now for about a year, and I just came back to Beijing, and I can't catch up with all the innovation, especially when it comes to social media and the internet and new ideas. Innovation was the first word in the last 5-year plan, and you can see it in Beijing. Beijing essentially is a huge contributor to the industries of tomorrow. AI, we're talking about social media, we're talking about all these things. Hugely important, and this is what underlines a lot of the tension between the US and China right now. Yes, we can talk about how many soybeans you buy or semiconductors, but essentially this is a battle for the future, the next industrial revolution, which, as we know, is going to be 5G, AI, automation, which is so underreported across the world. Now, the question is, do you nationalize these problems and create national champions that work in a globalized world, which sort of can fracture the industries of tomorrow, or do you try and come to some sort of understanding about how to manage the rise of these things? I mean, a few years ago, you would thought that China and the US would work to create the conditions of the future together. That is not happening. The one silver lining I see right now between the US and China, and the trade dispute and the other disputes I've just said, is that the data that we have seen over the last few weeks is horrible. If you look at the trade deficit, for example, from the US, it's ballooned despite Donald Trump's policy of sanctions. If you look at the data here in in China, domestic demand is slowing down. So this is focusing the minds, I think, of both Washington and Beijing. That the tit-for-tat tariffs, the talk about breaking up supply chains, the talk about going separate ways on the technologies of tomorrow is having fundamental effects very quickly, even with low tariff rates and spooking globalized business. I think that is going to focus the minds in the next couple of weeks. I really hope so anyway.
Victor, pick up on that just a bit. Talk about that, and also, and after 40 years of opening up, China once again is saying they want to make it easier for other nations, the U.S. In particular, to have foreign investment, to get a toehold in China. How significant is that coming out of this 2 sessions?
I think China-U.S. relations is a very big topic in the minds of the delegates and the representatives at the two sessions and the Chinese leadership. However, it is not very much talked about openly at the two sessions, mainly because I think the two sessions are very much focused on domestic issues. So the China-U.S. relations is very much in the background. However, let me say that in China, we have the confidence that the Chinese growth is continuing and nothing can really stop the Chinese growth. It will slow down in terms of the growth rate, but in terms of the absolute addition to the Chinese economy, it is going on. It's going on, and the Chinese economy, sooner or later, probably in 10 years' time, will be larger than that of the United States. So I think one key problem right now is that there are people in the United States who have not come to terms with the prospect that the Chinese economy eventually will be larger than that of the United States. And I think people need to come to the reality that this is going to happen. There is nothing to be worried about that. I think the United States need to realize that a larger China is not going to be enemy of the United States. China and the United States can get along if we really respect each other, treat each other as equals, and this probably will be better for world peace and development in the longer term.
Nathan, not trying to play favorites here, but I need to go back to you one more time. We only have about a minute. But tell me what you think we can look for in the coming days, because this is when the members get together and really hash out what is important to China.
Yeah, I think the foreign investment law is very important. But I think on the negative side, look at some of the provinces and how they're coping with the slowdown, especially in some of the provinces that depend on manufacturing and extraction of coal and the like. Big questions about provincial debt here. But what is encouraging, I think, is on the national level is the fact that there is no massive stimulus. There are some tax breaks, there are other stuff to encourage growth, but the country seems to be keeping its powder dry just in case a slowdown accelerates. So look out for that. And I do really think that over the next few days we're going to see some sort of reaction from Washington in terms of the foreign investment law, and that could propel a final deal when it comes to trade and other issues. Although no deal is done until a deal is done, so there's some nerves both in Beijing and in Washington if you read the papers.
Indeed, Nathan, well said. I want to thank Nathan and Victor for getting up early with us in Beijing. Thanks very much. And to my panel here in Washington, D.C. also. That does it for this edition of The Heat. Again, I'm Sean Calebs, filling in for Anand Naidu. Thanks for joining us, everyone.